Welcome everyone to Friday Fellowship Live with the Faith Mission in Canada. I'm aware this morning that my picture is quite blurry. Of course, as things go, the computer that I had planned to use crashed 3 times this morning and now will not work. So I'm using an older computer, and this is the camera that I have in these times of not being able to go find another camera. So I promised you'll be able to see Kathryn much better than you can see me. As you may be noticing if you're joining us and you've joined us before, Friday Fellowship Live is looking a little different this morning or this afternoon. We aren't broadcasting from Milton today, but we're broadcasting from Northern Ontario, which is fitting since we'll be joined by Kathryn Campbell from Northern Ireland. And our topic for today is Rainbows for Rainy Days, Suffering and the Promises of God. And today that is quite fitting. I'm sorry to have to share with you all this morning that the reason that I am the interviewer this morning is because Tim Condi lost his dad yesterday very suddenly. So we know that the Condis will value your prayers in the days to come. Obviously, with all that's happening in our world right now, he can't be with his family, which is, as you can imagine, quite difficult. They're back in Ireland and he is in Canada. So I told Tim that I would gladly take this morning. I am a big Kathryn Campbell fan, and so it's my pleasure to be able to help Tim out in this way this morning, or this afternoon, or this evening, depending on where you are. So if you've joined us before for Friday Fellowship Live and you've seen Tim talk about why we're doing this, you know that really we have 3 things that we want to achieve through this broadcast. We want to provide you with information, but not the type of information that you're getting from secular newscasts or social media, but as believers, these are strange times for anyone, but as believers, what are we to think? How can our actions during all of this bring glory to God? And that's the kind of information that we as the Faith Mission are hoping to provide you with through this. How do we look different than the world during these times? We also want to inspire you. The people that we're bringing on for these Friday Fellowship Lives, we believe will encourage you and have something to say to you that will leave you feeling inspired and ready to face the rest of your weekend and the rest of your week. And lastly, we want to facilitate intercession. We know that so many of you pray for us as a mission and as faith mission workers, but we want to be praying for you as well. So if there's ever anything that you would like prayer for, please feel free to message the mission page, leave a comment, or even just reach out to us. You can find all of our information for each staff member at thefaithmissioncanada.org, and we'd love to hear from you. We'd love to be able to pray with you. And lastly, if you've watched these before, you know that we like to add a little bit of fun every week. And we do that through Free Book Friday. So this week, I'm going to let Kathryn tell us a little bit about the book that we're giving away. And she's going to show you. But at the end of the broadcast, I'll talk more about how you can win that book. So stick around for that. So we're so glad that you joined us this week. And if you're just joining in, we will be joined in just a second by Kathryn Campbell from Northern Ireland. Kathryn is an author and a speaker there. And we've had her come to speak to the Faith Mission ladies retreats a couple of times now, and we've so appreciated her ministry. So we just thought that she would have something valuable to share with us this week. So I'm going to bring Kathryn in now, and hopefully, here we go.
Hello.
Hi, Kathryn.
Hi, April. You're looking much less blurry now, I must say. It's lovely to join you from across the pond.
Yes, we're very glad to have you. It looks like we have a little bit of matching curtains happening.
Yeah, a bit of grey and yellow.
Flowers. It's nice.
We'll have to
I
see.
think I like yours better though. It's nice. Kathryn, we thank you so much for being with us this morning, and we know that everything you have to say to us is timely for today, not just for what we're going through, but as I was talking with Tim this morning, just what a timely message for how do we as believers face suffering. And so we're really glad to have you. I know a lot of people watching this morning will already have read your books, some of your books, or have heard you speak before. But for those who are meeting you for the first time this morning, Kathryn, can you just share a little bit about yourself and your background?
Yes, certainly. First of all, my husband Philip and I would like to pass on our sincere sympathy and our love to Timothy and the family. It's a shame that we're not sharing this screen together, but we do send our love and our condolences. Yeah, I was born in Belfast, as you probably can tell by the accent. I didn't become a Christian until I was 14, although I was used to going to church every Sunday. I met my husband while I was still in my teens, and he headed off to Bible college, and I headed off to train as a nurse in Belfast Royal Victoria Hospital. That was during the time of what historically are known as Northern Ireland's Troubles. So that was a very unusual and exciting and also a very sad time. Philip and I married after he returned from Bible college and set to determined and wanted to serve the Lord. The first of our children arrived 2 years later. We had 3 children, 2 girls and a boy. Both of our daughters were born with profound multiple disabilities. Cheryl was our firstborn, Joy was our 3rd child, and we had Paul, very healthy and happy in between. And but unfortunately, both of the girls died. Cheryl aged 10, Joy age 13 at the time of their deaths. Philip has worked in Christian ministry all of his life, and it has been such a thrill to be alongside him as his wife and to really enjoy that. I worked as a nurse part-time for quite a while. About 15 years ago, I hung up my uniform, as they say, and decided to give more time to writing. I write, it's funny because sometimes it sounds a bit sad and morose, but I write a lot on the subject of suffering, and I think probably because of those almost 20 years with the girls and what we've come through about what the Lord teaches us through that. And I've written 7 books now, and the one I think you're giving away today is Rainbows for Rainy Days, as far as I...
Yes, that's right, exactly.
Yeah.
Thank you. I didn't have a copy of that one. I had a few of your other books, so Tim and I were hoping you'd have a copy with you to show everyone.
Yeah, that's right. Rainbows for Rainy Days is just a short devotional, really. It's a 40-day devotional on the promises of God, particularly helpful for those who are going through difficult times. And so you can imagine that it's useful for most people at some time or other, but actually it can be read by anyone at any time. So I'm glad that someone is going to enjoy getting a little parcel through their letterbox one of these days. But it's really great to have the opportunity to be with them.
Yeah, and we're excited this week, actually. If you stay tuned, folks, we actually are going to give away 2 copies of Rainbows for Rainy Days, and we'll tell you how you can win a copy for yourself and a friend who you think could use this book. So thanks for that, Kathryn. We know talking to you a little bit, and I have a lot of friends in Northern Ireland as well, in Ireland, and we know that you're going through right now the same things that we're going through in Canada. I think the rest of the world as well. I don't think really there's any part of the world right now that hasn't been touched by this pretty unique time with COVID-19. But even though it is a unique time, and I don't think any of us could remember a time in our own personal histories when we've gone through something quite like this, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about why suffering isn't unique to our time and our world.
Well, I think the word unusual and unprecedented are words that have really come to the fore, both in personal conversations and also across the airwaves with this pandemic that's going around. It's filling our conversations, isn't it? When we do manage to go out, maybe just to pick up stuff at the shops. and the impact actually is different for different people. It's not just something that we're seeing on a news bulletin that's happening far away. We hear people in our society, people maybe down the street or family members who have been affected, whether that is actually with their health, or very sadly sometimes because of their death, but it also affecting people in lots of other ways, whether it's financial, whether it's difficulties at home. And so it as a type of suffering that all of a sudden people are starting to think about the whole subject of human suffering. And so because of the pandemic, it almost seems as if the topic of suffering is kind of, in all of its forms, is kind of knocking on our door. And for some of us, it's actually sitting in our living rooms with us. And so it's not unique. It is rather, it's part of the human experience. And right since the days, if we go right back, and as you said, we're trying to look at these subjects completely differently. We're trying to look at what God has to say about what we find in his word. And so when we go right back to the book of Genesis, we actually see there are words that we now know only too well, but were new because of the disobedience of man, because of what the theologians call the fall of man. We see words like pain, we see words like death. You know, if look out into the garden and you see the thorns grow and the thistles grow and the weeds just keep springing up no matter what we can do about it. And that was not God's original plan. And so these things like pain and death and all of the other stuff that comes with it, they are actually normal. They're not unique experiences in our lives. But what I love is that even way back there in Genesis 3, right back when these words appeared, when we saw pain for the first time, right in the middle of it, God gave a promise. And that's what I love about God, because right in the middle of the gloom, right in the middle of when you thought, oh, Adam and Eve have, wrecked the whole system, it's all gone mad, God made a promise. In verse 15 of Genesis chapter 3, God promises a seed. He promises a savior, one who would one day destroy pain and death that we had just been introduced to. And yet here God was looking into the future and he was telling us, you know what? This is going to be dealt with. And I love that about God. I love that in the darkest day of man's history, God made a promise. The promise that he would get a way out for us, not just because of our sin and our wrongdoing, which is something that needs to be dealt with, but also because of the consequences of pain and death. And so suffering is not unique. It's part and parcel of our everyday lives. If you go right from Genesis and you go right through and you get into the New Testament, you hear the Apostle Peter write to a group of people that we call the early church. And there in 1 Peter and chapter 4 and verse 12, Peter is writing to these people who really can't work out what's going on in their lives. Their lives are in danger, their homes are threatened, and all because they have found Jesus as Savior. And he says to them, dear friends, don't be surprised at the fiery trials you're going through, as if something strange were happening to you. Now, we know in context he was actually writing about the fact that they were suffering for their faith. But I love it that he shows us right there in the New Testament, at the birth of the new church, he tells us that, look, this is not unique. Actually, suffering is normal. And I think one of the sad things that has come, I think, in many cases, if you'll excuse the expression, with the softening of the church, the idea that church is merely something just for us to enjoy, comes that idea that when tough stuff comes along, that somehow or other we have been picked on by God for something awful, that there's a malevolence that allows this to happen. This is not the case. In fact, the Bible clearly states that suffering is a universal phenomenon. Just as we've seen a pandemic, just as we've seen this virus creep, well, not actually creep, but literally fly across the world, we see that suffering is universal. But it's not in a vacuum. As we remember back in Genesis 3, when we thought everything had gone pear-shaped, God was there still in the middle of it all. And God put his promise in it, the promise of his presence and the promise of what was to happen in days to come. So suffering is not unique. None of us like it.
No.
And it doesn't mean to say that we should sit placidly by and do nothing, but it is not unique. In fact, it's not strange when these things happen to us. It's quite normal. But God is still there in the middle of it all.
Yeah, absolutely. And praise him for that he is.
Yeah.
I don't know how people go through these things without him. That's for sure. One thing I'm finding, and I'm sure you're finding the same, is that people have so many questions right now, and I'm sure the questions will continue into the future about their own personal suffering. You shared a little bit about what you've gone through in your life, Kathryn, but I wonder if you could share from your own experience the relevance and importance of trusting God and his promises at times like this.
Okay. Yeah, certainly. I think it's just so important that we get personal with these things, because we can have all the theology that we like, but actually if we don't actually get down there and personal, actually questions abound. And one of the books that I've written, I'm going to be bold and wave it at you.
Please do.
That I've written quite extensively in is this book, Broken Works Best, When God Changed Pain into Gain. It's now being republished by 10 Publishing. And the whole subject of questions is kind of a bit different to what you're asking me. But the business of questions is that very often we don't ask questions. We're quite accepting until suffering knocks our door, until that phone call, until the sitting in front of the doctor, until all of a sudden you're not allowed to go out of your house and you're afraid to stand in the queue at the supermarket, until these things that happen. And being a human being, I don't know about you, but life is so busy that I want everything yesterday. I want an answer. You know, I want an answer. I just want my answer now. And so when these problems come along and when suffering comes knocking at our door, we want a quick answer. Well, if I've discovered anything, one of the things I've discovered is that God is never in a hurry. He doesn't kind of do it my way. And when I was thinking about this, and I was thinking about even sharing some of those things, I was just thinking that actually he's wise. We kind of feel that if we knew it all, if we knew what his purposes were, if we knew what he's going to do next, then maybe we could get ourselves psyched up and we could do something about it. When in fact, if I had been told as a young mother in my early 20s what my life was going to be like, I don't think humanly and emotionally or even spiritually that I actually could have been able to come to terms with it. It just wouldn't have been possible. And yet God gives us these promises and these things to help us to get through it, but only step by step. We don't get our answers all at once. There are so many of God's promises that I absolutely love. Isaiah 40:31 is one I would say lots of people watching could just quote right off the top. I mean, who doesn't love it? Who doesn't love the fact that God promises to renew our strength? You know, when you think you can't face another thing and God says he's going to renew our strength. Who amongst us would not love that opportunity that God says he's going to enable us to mount up with wings like eagles, to be able to look at things from a different perspective, the perspective that we have now. And he promises that we would be able to run and not be weary. And then that great verse ends with that he also promises to walk with us through the everyday mundane, you know, the stone in the shoe stuff that goes on, and that we'll walk through it, but we'll not faint. And it's an amazing promise. It's a promise that you want to cling on to. It's a promise that you want to quote. It's a promise that you kind of think if you say it enough times to yourself, you'll be able to get through the day. Yeah. It is an amazing promise, but we've left out the first line, haven't we? Because it's a conditional promise. As many of the promises in God's word are, they're conditional, because we're told by Isaiah that this promise, these things are all available for those who wait on the Lord.
It's that waiting, right?
It's the waiting. It's the delivery method, if you like, for the promise. The promise is there, but God is relational. He works with us. And so he asks us to wait. You see, for those who are watching, who are going through tough stuff just at the minute, Kathryn Campbell can't offer you a quick fix for anything. Neither can Faith Mission.
No, absolutely not.
Neither can April Hardwick. There is no quick fix. You can buy yourself a little promise box and pull them out as you wish, and that's a lovely thing to do. But you know what? That is not going to fix it. What God asks of us is that we trust him with what we don't understand. He wants us to leave the big questions with him. He wants us to get to know who he is. And I think it's very important, this bit, because really he wants us to know who he is, because what he does cannot be separated from who he is. We need to know who he is in order that we can trust him. You mentioned even about maybe sharing something a little more personal about how that kind of plays out.
Yeah.
You know, for almost 20 years, we cared for one or both of those little girls whom we loved so very much. And those 20 years were not full of quick answers. Instead, they were filled with waiting on the Lord. They were filled with learning about him. And I have often said that I have been to God, to places with God that I could never have dreamt were possible if it wasn't for the waiting times, if it wasn't for the getting to know who he really is. And to discover not only his promises as if there's some magic in them, but also to discover what he's doing in the heartache, what he's doing in it. And right at the beginning of the journey, God made me a promise, the promise of his presence. I pleaded with him for healing. And he promised that he would walk with me through it. Those wonderful verse, and another one from Isaiah 43, verse 2, where God promised me his presence, that he would walk with me through the deep waters and through the rivers of disappointment and all of that. And then as I got used to actually looking a bit deeper, and as I got was made aware more of his presence even in those dark times, I experienced then what it meant bit by bit, when the girls wouldn't sleep, when the seizures wouldn't stop, when the next doctor's appointment just brought more bad news. And in amongst the mix, he did something really beautiful, because he then showed me what real peace was. He gave me the promise of his peace. And in these days, there are so many people who are afraid. And the promise of his peace, there's many of them, but I love that one in John 14 and verse 27, because he talks about giving us a peace that cannot be compared with anything else that the world has to offer. And so with his presence and with his peace, I soon started to learn that he had a plan. When heartache comes, it seems as if there's no sense to it, as if there's no roadmap, as if it just has dropped on your lap and you know what, you're just going to have to get on with it. But actually God has a plan. And I learned, and sometimes verses become very trendy, don't they? You see them up, hanging up, you see them crocheted, you see them everywhere.
Magnet.
Yeah, you know, that very trendy verse for many years has been Jeremiah 29 verse 11.
Yeah.
You know? And yet it's only as you go through the very difficult times that you actually realize that his plan is not to harm us.
Right.
Actually for our good. And so those different promises came through all of those times, and much, much more. And it would take far too long for me to tell you that. But I think one of the things that I would like to say in closing that part of the question was that even in the darkest days, the days of death, the days when Cheryl died when she was 10 and then Joy when she was 13, I learned a truth that has been seared, I would say, and I know that sounds quite dramatic, but seared on my soul. Death is not the end. There are people going into hospital today in Canada. There are people going into hospital today in Northern Ireland and in the UK, and they're afraid. They're afraid. The figures that we have, 50% of those going into ICU will not come out of it alive, and they're afraid. And unfortunately, death is the big taboo that people do not want to talk about. But I want to say that death is not the end, that we are eternal beings. We're eternal beings. Just think of the Apostle Paul's writing in Romans 8 and verse 18. He says that the sufferings of this present time, now his present time was different than ours, but that's what's so wonderful about the Bible. It is relevant whatever century that you live in. And he says that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory that shall be revealed to us. You know what? That gives me hope. That gives me hope. Absolutely. Not a wishy-washy maybe, but a biblical hope that means a confident expectation in the one who I've come to know even better because of suffering. That hope, that means that what ahead is far, far better than what's going on now.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. You sort of have touched on this already, but I just, as we think about, we're not unique in our suffering, that's for sure. And that we do have a God that we can trust in. So as we live this out before a world that doesn't necessarily know our God, one of the things that you talk about in your book is Genesis 9 and Noah seeing the rainbow. And you mentioned tracing the rainbow through the rain. So how can we as believers really do that? What does that look like in our real life as a believer? How does that make us different?
Yeah, that devotional thought opens Rainbows for Rainy Days, and actually came to me standing in the Maid in the Mist going into the Niagara Falls when I first visited, which of course is very close to the Faith Mission headquarters. And it was just amazing because in Genesis 9:13, God promises Noah, makes a promise to Noah, and he says to him, I've set my rainbow in the cloud. It's going to be a covenant sign, not just a promise, something that cannot be broken. A covenant sign between me and the earth that never again will the waters become a flood to destroy all life. And it's just amazing, that promise. You can just imagine what things were like when Noah left the ark. He'd been on it for a year. He gets off the ark, and God had provided a place of refuge for him. That was the ark, in order that he wouldn't perish. But when he got off the ark, I kind of sometimes wonder, what must it have been like when he saw the first cloud coming over the sky? Was it, oh dear, here it comes again, we need to get back on? You kind of think, what were his fears? Were his fears that things would go back to the way they were? And what did God do in his mercy and in his love was he put something in the very thing, a promise in the very thing that probably frightened Noah the most as a human being when he got off the ark. He put that rainbow there. He put that rainbow there, and every time he saw the rainbow, excuse me, that rainbow was a sign that God was not going to destroy the earth by flood ever again. And you know, in the simplest of terms, and I have 2 little grandchildren now, and in the simplest of terms, if one of them said to me, Granny, how do you get a rainbow? You know, I kind of think that the simplest of term is just that a rainbow happens whenever light shines through water droplets. You see, you can't have a rainbow without water. The brightest rainbows are always after the worst of the storms. And I have proved that if you think of the rainbow as a sign of the promise of God, I have proved that down through those very tough times in my life, that God has placed a rainbow. He has placed his promise. He has placed his word. You see, that first rainbow came, as I've just described, whenever we were told about Cheryl and her disability, and how God promised me his presence through that time. And I discovered then, as I do pass on now, that Christians are not immune from trouble. Absolutely. Somehow or other we get this notion that, you know, well, I'm a believer, why should this happen to me? But that is not true. It is not the truth. There is nowhere in God's word where we're promised a trouble-free life, but we are promised his presence with us. We are promised his peace to still our fears. We are promised what lies ahead, all of those things that we've talked about just now. And the tracing the rainbow through the rain, as you probably know, that line actually comes from a very famous hymn. I'm just going to read you that verse and it says, "O joy that seekest me through pain, I cannot close my heart to thee. I trace the rainbow through the rain and feel the promise is not vain. That morn shall tearless be." And so we see that tracing the rainbow is all about getting to know who God is. Right. Tracing the rainbow is looking for him in the storm, not looking how to survive the storm. The surviving is his job, but looking for him in it and learning more about him in it is what actually gets us through it. And so I would say, as we trace the rainbow, we need so much to look for him, to not just follow him, but get to know him in ways that sometimes we're just paddling along the shore and he wants us to move into deep waters. You know, very often, as you know, I share my testimony with ladies groups, and I've written my story in the book Under the Rainbow. And I kind of, you know, I'm over 60 now. I know it looks, but I'm over 60 now. And every now and then I say, look, I've been talking about this for an awful long time. Is it not time for me to stop doing this?
I don't think so.
Every time I ask God, can I stop this, please? I kind of think the psychiatrists and psychologists would have a field day with me there. She is all these years later, just still talking about it. But God brings me back to purpose, and purpose for my life came when I read that wonderful verse in Philippians 1, where it talks about the things that have happened to me have happened for the sake of the gospel.
Yeah.
And so we look for him in the storm rather than just to survive the storm. We can trace the rainbow as we look. He still gives visible symbols, and that's going to sound a bit strange. And the visible symbols that he gives us today are actually words. And his words are found in the Bible. And if you want to hear God speak, if you want to see what he has to say with you, even if it takes a wee while, look and open the book, because he will speak to you. Trace the rainbow. We need to know him.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. I hope you don't stop talking about it, because it's true. You constantly bring glory back to the Lord with your story, and so I think it needs to be told again and again.
Thank you.
I won't keep you too much longer, Kathryn, but I wonder if, just as a way of wrapping up today, what would be your final challenge or thought that you would want people to come away from this broadcast with?
Well, I think as I've been mentioning the family, and I have been mentioning the fact that now is not all there is. That's the most important thing. You know what? Life is often unkind. Death is not only serious, but death brings heartbreak. It brings heartache. I would never want to belittle anything that anyone is going through. We will always be a family of 5. I miss my girls today, maybe even more, because it's been so long since I've seen them. I miss my girls today every day. And at the minute, while we are still a family of 5, 2 of our family can't actually visit us just now. Now we're getting a wee bit of a taste of this, aren't we, with this lockdown with coronavirus, because you can't go and see your granny, and you can't go here, and you can't see friends, and you can't get together. The sun's shining in Northern Ireland. It hasn't stopped shining since we've been in lockdown, whereas it usually rains most of the time, you know, so you have your barbecue on your own out in the back instead of and we have that separation and that idea of separation. But we keep encouraging each other. My son keeps saying to me, don't worry, Mum, it's not for long. It won't be long before we can come and see you and you can see the grandchildren. It's only for a little while. And, you know, in a very small way, it's a little bit like death. Only with death, the temporary is a little bit longer.
Yeah.
With coronavirus. Death is hard. But this is what I want to leave with you as we say goodbye. I believe God is the great promise giver, but I also believe he is the great promise keeper. And I believe that he has, as it says in Ecclesiastes 3, verse 11, that he has put eternity in our hearts. It's a wee bit like if you're going hiking and you've got a compass and the needle always points north. Well, God has put an internal compass into our being. He has put eternity in our hearts. There is more than now. We will always know the way that we are going because he's put eternity in our hearts. And then he promises to make everything beautiful in its time. Even COVID-19. Yeah. How can that happen? Because now is not all there is. Now is not all there is. And I would like to say, God bless you, everyone. And thank you so much for your patience with me today.
Oh, thank you so much, Kathryn. We really appreciate you taking the time out of your day and sharing your thoughts with us. And I know, do you have a website that people could find your books on if they are not? I wonder if I could get you when technology's not on my side today again, so I'm not going to try and share your website here just in case I crash us all. But I'm going to post the link to win the free book. I wonder if you wouldn't mind just posting where people could find your books underneath that, maybe in a comment, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you very much. God bless. Bye.
Bye. Thanks, Kathryn. Well, thank you for joining us today. I hope that you were as blessed and encouraged by Kathryn as I have been this morning. And just a reminder that we have a hope that is a different hope than the world has. And so let's just continue to live out that hope in front of a world who's looking for answers. And thanks, Kathryn, for sharing just a little bit about what that can look like. All right, so tune in next week. There will be another broadcast of, what are we calling this? Friday Fellowship Live. And we will have another person to interview to share encouragement from the Word of God. Thanks for joining us.